Thanks for joining us on a road trip through rabbinic narrative. No agenda, just clarity. The Midrash I want to take up in this episode has always been a special one for me because it appears in my Bar Mitzvah Parsha, Parshas Vayetze. I've probably learned these psukim and midrashim surrounding them dozens of times over the years. But the funny thing is, the older I've gotten, the less interested I've become in the midrashim themselves and more interested in the actual psukim that give rise to them. In the beginning of Parshas Vayetze, the Torah tells us that Yaakov leaves Beersheba. He's running away from Esav. He comes to a place as the sun is setting. He takes some stones from that place, sets them up by his head, and goes to sleep. Then the Torah tells us about the famous dream he had with the ladder extending up to Shemayim and the Malachim. And then he wakes up the next morning, takes a stone and sets it up as a matzeva. So immediately there's something strange to notice in the words of the psukim. Originally, it tells us that he took multiple stones to place around his head. And then when he woke up, he took one stone from where his head was and set it up as a matzeva. So how many stones are we dealing with here? Were there many stones, or was there one stone? So Rashi famously quotes the Midrash that the stones began arguing with one another, each one saying that they want the righteous person to rest his head on me, until Hashem makes them into one stone. So most of the explanations that I've heard up until this point assumed that that's the whole point of the Midrash. It's addressing the textual inconsistency and explaining it. But what really caught my attention wasn't Rashi, it was another version of the Midrash in Bereishis Rabbah. Over there are three opinions about how many stones Yaakov actually set up and what their significance was. Rabbi Yehudah is of the opinion that Yaakov deliberately took 12 stones, and he said to himself, Hashem decreed that there will be 12 Shvatim. Avraham didn't establish them. Yitzchak didn't establish them. So if these 12 stones become united into one, then I'll know that I will establish the 12 Shvatim. To me, that's an astounding suggestion. Where did Rabbi Yehudah get this idea from? The psukim don't tell us this yet. Yaakov's not even married. He doesn't have any children. So I'd like to understand what makes Rabbi Yehudah portray Yaakov's focus in this way. Because Rabbi Yehudah is saying something really interesting. He's not just addressing the grammatical challenge of the psukim, but he's pointing to a much bigger question that the psukim don't even mention. Before trying to answer that, I think we need to go back to the psukim themselves and understand the pshat a little better. Because the Torah seems to be unusually interested in these stones. I think we can ask the question, why are the stones mentioned at all? It could have just said that Yaakov came to the place and he fell asleep. Instead, it pauses to tell us exactly what he slept on. And then after he wakes up from the dream, he takes that very stone and turns it into a monument. Why? How is the stone significant in any way as a result of his dream? I think the answer begins with understanding the situation that Yaakov's in right now. He's running away from Esav for fear of his life. He's going to Haran, and he has instructions from his mother to find a wife there. But for all he knows, he's leaving home. He has no idea what to expect. He doesn't know when he's going to come back. And he also has nothing with him. Some of the Mefarshim point out that the stones emphasize his poverty and his vulnerability. He doesn't have a tent. He doesn't have a bed. He has no possessions. Just these rocks that he found in this place. So it seems like the stones are important because it's the way the Torah is helping us understand the position that Yaakov is in and perhaps the emotional framework that he's operating in. And then he goes to sleep, and all of a sudden, Hashem appears to him. And Hashem makes a lot of grand promises about inheriting this land, having lots of children that will burst forth and inhabit the land. And then he ends by saying something that you don't find in any of the messages of Hashem to Avraham and Yitzchak, which is that I'll be with you, I'll guard you wherever you go, I will not abandon you until these promises have been fulfilled. Those promises are striking because they're exactly the promises someone in Yaakov's situation really needs to hear. And then Yaakov wakes up, and you have to pay attention to how he responds. His response doesn't really focus on the grand promises that Hashem makes, but they're actually very practical. If Hashem will be with me, if he gives me bread to eat, clothing to wear, returns me safely to my father's house. Notice what Yaakov is responding to. He's not responding to the parts of the Nevuah that I think the average person would. When we study that Nevuah, I know my attention is immediately drawn to the ladder and the malachim coming up and down. But that's not what impacts Yaakov. He doesn't start discussing theological and philosophical ideas having to do with malachim and God as a result of this Mar Nevuah. Rather, he's worried about the most basic elements for survival: bread, clothing, a home. He's hearing Hashem's promises through the eyes of someone who is sleeping on stones. And maybe that's exactly why he takes this stone and sets it up as a matzeva, as a monument. Before the Mar Nevuah, before the dream, the stones that Yaakov took highlight his vulnerability. After the dream, those very stones, or that very stone, becomes associated with the change in perspective that Yaakov had. He's not just a vulnerable refugee escaping Beersheba. Now he's someone with the confidence of Hashem's promises as he heads towards Haran. And that's a major shift emotionally for Yaakov and the perspective that he has on his situation. That is something worth establishing a monument for, something to be able to return to and reflect upon. But then Bereishis Rabbah steps in, and I think it's asking us to take a step back and look at this night from a different perspective. Not just from the perspective of Yaakov, the individual, the refugee running away from Esau, from his home, but as Yaakov, who is the person transitioning from the stage of the Avos to the stage of Bnei Yisrael. Now Yaakov is encountering a different challenge than Avraham and Yitzchak had. The question for Avraham and Yitzchak was, which one of the sons are going to carry on the covenantal relationship with Hashem? So to speak, which one's going to be admitted and which one's going to be excluded? The Midrash seems to shift our attention. Now the challenge for Yaakov is not who's admitted and who's excluded, because they're all going to be a part of Bnei Yisrael. But that doesn't mean the challenge disappears. It changes. The question is no longer simply who belongs. The question becomes, how does a family this large, this diverse, ever become one people? As we continue reading, that's exactly what we're going to see. Rivalry, jealousy, tension among the brothers. Evidently, this is not an easy task. Actually, the next part of the Midrash, the next opinion, is that Yaakov took 3 stones and said exactly that. Abraham, 1 stone. He had a Pesolis. He had a part of his progeny that needed to be removed. Yitzchak as well had a part of his progeny, Esau, that needed to be removed. Yaakov no longer has that. Yaakov's progeny are going to be part, but they're going to experience a different challenge. And that's also a major transition that's taking place this very. The vulnerability that Yaakov is experiencing right now because of his situation as refugee, as destitute, is actually something that the Chazal are helping us to see as part of the story that's about to unfold in Haran, in his encounter with Lavan, in the fact that he gets tricked into marrying Leah, the extensive number of years that he ends up working for Lavan and then being in Haran, and how that impacts the dynamics of the family. It's as if Chazal are telling us, before you continue to read about Yaakov's story, here's the lens through which to read it and understand everything that's about to happen. Because from this point on, every challenge within Yaakov's family is no longer just a family story. It's part of the formation of Bnei Yisrael. And if that's true, Bereishis Rabbah isn't really commenting on the stones. It's framing everything that's about to happen. So it's really interesting because when first learning this Midrash, it seems like it's just trying to explain a textual inconsistency in the Torah. And then it starts going off into a story about stones. But after thinking this through, it makes me wonder whether Bereishis Rabbah isn't really interested in the stones at all. Maybe the stones are simply the way Chazal introduced the next stage of the story. As we continue reading about Yaakov's life, the marriages, the brothers, Yosef, I wonder if Chazal are inviting us to carry the following question as we continue reading about Yaakov's story. How will 12 tribes, each so different from one another, ever become one people? Thanks so much for joining us. Next time we're going to be in the middle of the 9 days, and I'd like to revisit one of the famous Agadot found in Mesafek Gittin surrounding the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. The Gemara tells us a remarkable story about the Roman general Nero. For what begins with shooting arrows ends with something completely unexpected. A Roman general who converts to Judaism and ends up being the progenitor of Rabbi Meir. Is this just a genealogical vignette? Or does this story help us understand and appreciate more about the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash? See you on the next road trip.